In my mind, markets are the most anti-discriminatory economic systems we could possibly have.
Maybe from an economic perspective here is really, if we have passed peak woke, it's the mindset of top-down economic planning that was fundamentally the issue with net zero.
In less than 5 years, the number of claimants has gone up by over 1 million, and that's absolutely unprecedented.
Hello and welcome to the IEA Podcast. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Communications Manager here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Clougherty, the IEA's Executive Director, and Kristian Niemietz, the IEA's Editorial Director. Today we are going to be discussing Kemi's net zero pledges, the government's new announcement on benefits, but first, let's talk about whether the left have turned on woke. Kristian.
Well, yes, it looks that way. Partly a strategic pivot, I guess, because wokery no longer has the same bite as it used to have, certainly in 2020, 21, at the height of the progressive hysteria. So what's happening now is that until about 5 minutes ago, it was possible to treat basically the woke and the socialists as one and the same thing. And what we've seen over the past couple of weeks is that some high-profile socialists are now turning on woke progressivism, saying that it doesn't really help their own cause, and that is a split which we just didn't see that before. So there have always been, say, very orthodox Marxists who have always hated identity politics because they say we should focus on the class struggle. That's what matters, and not about wishy-washy subjective identity categories where it's about pronouns and lived experience and whatever. They say this is all nonsense. We have to talk about material factors, hard material reality. But that was a fringe position. And it's also never been entirely accurate because maybe I shouldn't do this, but I've been reading a lot of woke nonsense, especially at the height of the of this BLM-induced hysteria, 2020-21. And what I've always noticed was that there is always an anti-capitalist angle to this. Mm-hmm. So this idea that was popular amongst the centrist and center-left media for a while, that wokery is essentially that it has emerged because the wider left has given up on economics or lost interest in economics. That's not really true. So woke progressives are not going to comment on, say, the latest inflation announcements or the latest OBR forecast. If that's what you mean by economics, then yes, it's fair to say woke progressives are not interested in economics. But what they do is they do make broader points about economic systems, and in particular, they always link the supposed oppressions of victim groups that they claim to care about. They always link that back to capitalism. They always say in the end, but the real solution, the only solution in the end is we have to smash capitalism. So they have this idea that divisions in society are deliberately created by the capitalist ruling class, by the bourgeoisie, and they do this to stop the proletariat from getting together and organizing. They are trying to divide people on the basis of ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, whatever, just artificial categories where they say, you guys, you shouldn't work together because on this identity category or that one, you're on different sides, and I'll somehow try to pitch you against each other so that you keep fighting. And then as the fat cat capitalist, I can lean back and say, well, the proletarians are fighting. That's great. That means I stay in power. So that was always the idea. And that's why anti-capitalist socialists were so keen on woke progressivism. So for them, it wasn't an alternative to the things they normally talk about, the economics. It's more that was a different means, a different channel to promote the usual anti-capitalism. Now, of course, it's become clear in recent years that it doesn't work out that way. The way progressivism really plays out is that you get well, firstly, it's a left-on-left fight very often, that you get slightly different shades of leftists trying to cancel each other. It becomes a status signaling arms race, which I'd say was totally predictable because that's just how the modern left operates. And what also happens is that you get that progressivism can be quite easily co-opted. So you can have private companies, even large companies, multinational corporations, showing off about how diverse they are and showing and writing reports saying, and this is how much we spend on inclusivity, and this is how much money we give to BLM and all that kind of stuff. And it's all very sanctimonious and performative. And socialist leftists are just realizing, okay, we may have cultural dominance in these areas, but that doesn't bring us closer to overthrowing capitalism. Because you could imagine an economy where every company is super diverse, every company gives lots of money to BLM and spends money on diversity training and all that. But even such an economy would still be capitalist. And they're now waking up to that.
I mean, you're effectively saying, Kristian, and perhaps it's worth pointing out, you wrote a good piece on this for the IEA Substack, insider.iea.org.uk. Everyone should sign up. It is your argument, basically, that the anti-capitalist left has started, some of them at least, to turn on identity politics because they see it as a hindrance to their deeper cause rather than something that furthers it. That maybe it's easier to advance their hard left economic agenda if it's decoupled from a very radical progressive idea of identity. I mean, is that sort of the essence of this?
Yes, and it's become clearer to them, what should always have been clear, that it has also provoked a backlash, including among some other people. They need to get on board. So this was already an issue in definitely the 2019 election. That was Corbyn's problem, that the people that he tried to reach were on opposite sides of the culture war. That you had some people who were very keen on his economic policy and who hate private companies and get angry about profits, but who are just culturally on the opposite side of the spectrum, and they failed to build that cross-cultural coalition.
Yeah, kind of like working class conservatives, so that are more traditional in that respect. I do think what's interesting is you have got people like Ash Sarkar who are now writing books effectively arguing that the culture war and obsession about identity has taken away from that class struggle, and that actually the real struggle is about your class and it's whether or not you come from a working class background, and that is the real struggle, and that anything that takes away from that is effectively going to not further aim. So in that respect, to answer your question, that's what some of them are arguing. In my mind, markets are the most anti-discriminatory economic systems we could possibly have. Gary Becker wrote about the economics of discrimination and argued that in a competitive market, especially one that's at a larger scale, companies end up basically being motivated to not discriminate against people as a result of them being rational economic entities. And instead, what ends up happening is people are treated as an economic entity or indeed as an individual based on their merit. Now, in some cases, companies might discriminate against a certain person because they have the means to do so, but there's going to be an economic pressure or competitive pressure to not discriminate, and it could actually eat into their profits if they do so. So I do think it's interesting from a theoretical perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've always tried to stay out of cultural stuff as much as possible. Of course, there is a very clear individualist and classical liberal take on it, I think, which is that, you shouldn't be against progress and you shouldn't be against people expressing themselves however they want to. But when you're trying to enforce particular group identities and put everyone into particular buckets and make them think of themselves and make everyone see them as parts of lots of different collectives, some of which are more privileged than others. This is, I think it's philosophically wrong, it's economically destructive, but it's also a terrible kind of psychology for a society to get into. So having said I don't do culture war, maybe there's just a little bit of culture war for you. But what I think is interesting from an IEA perspective, maybe from an economic perspective here, is really if we have passed peak woke, and if maybe some of the people who were the real tribunes of woke ideology are now saying, oh, no, we went a bit too far, let's row back from that. Maybe it tells you something about the rise and fall of ideas and the way they're transmitted. And I can remember the first time someone talked to me about like microaggressions, and they said, well, everyone's going to be talking about microaggressions in a few years, just wait. I thought they were crackers, but actually it happened much sooner than you thought. And all of this kind of like privilege stuff, I mean, it took over discourse in a serious way. And, it starts with the kind of the elites, the intellectuals. It kind of infects the young and the fashionable. It takes over your sort of cultural institutions and your popular conversation. And then, of course, people who are in the middle, who probably don't have strong feelings one way or the other about most things, but want to feel like they're on the right side of history, will go along with it. And then it seems like it's captured everything. And it's some kind of inescapable ideological straitjacket that everything has to be kind of viewed through. Everything has to be viewed through that prism. But maybe what you're starting to see, and I certainly discern it as well, is that we reached a peak and people thought, no, hold on, this has gone too far. And I think actually some of the transgender stuff really just pushed the envelope a bit too much because it was
Sturgeon down.
Well, but it was very clearly trying to get people to believe or say they believe things which are plainly untrue, or that they can perceive as being untrue. And I'm not saying that to try and offend anybody, but there's something very George Orwell in 1984 about saying, don't trust what you see and what you know to be true, parrot the appropriate ideology of the time. And I think people pushed back against that on the left as well as on the right. And so now maybe it goes into reverse. But the interesting thing here is that I don't think all of this stuff is going to just disappear overnight. It may not be the fashionable cause célèbre anymore. But funnily enough, even as elites and intellectuals maybe turn away from this and maybe younger generations will find some different weird things to be enthusiastic about, probably in the wider group of people who don't pay too much attention but just want to feel like they're doing the right thing, this stuff will linger for a while. Kind of like any fashion, once the fashionistas have moved on, the kind of ordinary Joes are still wearing like last year's outfits or like the outfits from 5 years ago. And I think that's why when you see in the newspapers all of the political correctness gone mad stuff, it's not normally coming from the vanguard of the progressive movement anymore. It's normally coming from like some provincial police force who are just trying to do the things that they think everybody is meant to do at the moment.
And some enforcing current legislation.
Yeah.
It does seem as though there is this counterculture, and indeed it is on the left as well. But I do remember when I was at university, there was definitely an element of what you've just described in which people are effectively trying to do the best that they can, or trying to be seen as though they are progressive and they are part of the good guys, they're on the right side of history, or whatever it is. And so they're completely co-opted by this ideology. And again, the economic consequences of that are people that end up feeling as though in order for them to end racism, they have to end capitalism, and that's ultimately what that conclusion comes to.
I think you could see a little bit of Hayek's The Intellectuals and Socialism, that famous essay in this, and that was why I brought this topic up actually. And you can in a way think of The Intellectuals and Socialism as expressing the founding principles of the IEA, even though I think it was written after the IEA was founded. But Hayek had talked about those ideas before, and it was basically that if you want to change a society, you don't do it through frontline politics. You do it by winning over the intellectuals to better reasoned, well-argued ideas. And in the long run, they create this kind of intellectual climate or climate of opinion, which then other people adhere to. And that's how you shift the Overton window. You change what is possible for politicians to do and the directions that the policy can go. So in a strange way, this story of the rise and apparent fall and hopeful eventual fall of wokery, as Kristian says, maybe that also shows you the way that economics and good economic ideas, or indeed bad economic ideas, can spread and so on as well.
And how they end up getting disseminated.
Yeah.
Before we move on, I just want to mention, I also think that from a legislative perspective, I don't think that woke is dead. And of course, we still have the Equalities Act, and we published a paper about this earlier this year, effectively arguing that until we get rid of the indirect discrimination part of the Equalities Act, this kind of stuff is still going to linger and it's still going to filter out. There's also the government, and Callum Price and I spoke about this in a separate video earlier this week, effectively looking at the government's consultation on pay discrimination. And the government are consulting on extending the compulsory gender pay gap reporting to disability and to ethnicity, despite the fact that there are a whole host of unintended consequences as a result, which you can learn more about if you watch that video.
Well, this stuff is all hardwired into the system now, so it's, Yeah,
and that's the difference with conventional fashions, because even though it's, I think, fairly accurate to describe these ideas as fads and fashions, and it is clearly driven by, in a lot of cases, you want to be seen as having the fashionable opinion and be with the zeitgeist. But unlike conventional fashions, it also gets enshrined in law and it has actual institutions dealing with this, whereas there is no specific institution that makes the average Joe wear last year's fashion or last decade's fashion. Yeah. And therefore, actual fashions can die out more quickly, whereas in the case of politically driven fashions, we actually then have institutions that are based around this and they stay around for much longer, even if the initial justification or the initial fashion driving it may have disappeared. Once you have a legislative basis, and it's just, you just get institutional inertia. So maybe a bit less in the private sector. I saw something on hiring figures for diversity-related roles, which 3 years ago were at the absolute peak. You could absolutely make a lucrative career out of just talking about diversity, and it's going down now. But yeah, it's still that doesn't mean it falls to zero. It's roughly where it was in just before 2020,
and it's still embedded in our legislation. So moving on. Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Conservative Party, delivered a speech earlier this week where she spoke about net zero. Could you tell us a bit about what she said?
Yeah, and I think actually this is another example of an idea which started off as fringe, became fashionable, achieved almost the status of religion. And then in this case, actually, the wheels have come off extremely quickly. And suddenly something which seemed a kind of unquestionable part of modern political ideology a few years ago on the left and the right now is being called into serious question. And this is the idea of net zero by 2050. And I don't think it's so much the idea of eventual decarbonisation, which people are completely running away from. I mean, to a certain extent, yes, people have called on that idea as well once the costs have become more apparent. But I also think it's this idea of trying to orient everything that government does and indeed try and get businesses on board as well, really try and orient your entire society around a mission to achieve a particular objective in 2050, and to do it in a way which is basically very top down, very heavily planned, and all of this. So, yeah, Kemi Badenoch gave a speech on, was it Monday, Tuesday, whatever. Tuesday. It was on Tuesday. This is an irrelevant detail, but there you go. Basically saying net zero, it's not possible to achieve it. There's no plan to get there. It's a bad idea. The Conservatives are dropping this as part of their policy platform. And so I think she's right in two ways and then maybe wrong in a couple of ways as well. So I think the first thing, right to jettison net zero as a target and as a plan and a way of organising government. This was going to be catastrophically expensive. It was going to involve a huge amount of central direction of the economy and economic planning, and they were bound to make horrible mistakes and waste lots of money at the same time. I don't think that people had ever really been brought along and made aware of the sacrifices that would have to be made in the pursuit of net zero the way the government was going to do it. And so, right, good. Obviously, it needs to be followed up with a more pro-market, free market energy policy platform, and we'll see if that emerges. I think the other way in which this was a sensible thing for Kemi Badenoch to do, and I'll try not to lapse into political commentary here, but it clearly, I think the Conservative Party, having been delivered such a massive kicking at the general election after nearly a decade and a half in government, they need to repudiate some of the things they did or failed to do in office if they're going to be taken seriously again. And if people are not going to just think, well, look, you had plenty of time to do these wonderful things you're telling us about. Why should we trust you? And this is a very symbolic one because it was a Conservative government. It was Theresa May right at the tail end of her administration that forced through this net zero target and created this idea that everything in government should be oriented around getting to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And so this is just a start, but I think it's a big symbolic one to say this new version of the Conservative Party, whatever it ends up looking like, is going to be different in some big and serious ways from the one that you had until the general election last summer. A couple of things, though, that I think were slightly, striking the wrong note in that speech. The first was framing it as around impossibility. Now, I don't think the problem with net zero is that it's impossible. Actually, it's probably possible. The question is whether it's desirable and indeed whether it's desirable at the necessary cost. Right. So maybe this is just semantics, but I think it's important. We shouldn't just be saying we're giving up on this bad idea because we realized it can't be done. It should be we're giving up on this bad idea because we've realized it's a terrible idea and the costs are enormous and not worthwhile. The second thing is that she said there isn't a plan. There was never a plan to deliver this. Now, it's sort of partly true. There wasn't a realistic plan, but there were lots of plans. And in fact, and I'm probably just being a bit harsh by picking up on the terminology here, but I would say the whole problem is planning. It's the mindset of top-down economic planning that was fundamentally the issue with net zero. Yeah. It would be quite possible to achieve net zero if you wanted to, or some other target, in a much more pro-market, unplanned way, say by having a carbon price across the economy, etc., etc. Obviously, that's controversial in its own way as well. But the lack of a plan was not the problem. The problem was that there was a lot of plans.
Yeah. No, I think it is interesting from that perspective, purely because 2050 is so arbitrary, and net zero, I think one of the real big problems of net zero was always that it was just an incredibly arbitrary target, and you're reorientating the entire government in order to achieve that target at the expense of cheap energy. And we could have cheap and abundant energy.
Well, ask yourself this: why 2050?
Yes,
because 50 is a cool round number.
Yes, exactly.
Why net zero rather than +5 or -10? Yeah, again, it sounds cool.
It's just cool.
All true, the speech may not have been ideal, and it does show that, contrary to some conspiracy theories, politicians' speeches are not actually written in Tufton Street, because if we had written that one, it would have been a very different speech. But nonetheless, what we see here, irrespective of the details of the announcement, is the Overton window shifting in real time. And that has happened before when net zero became a thing. I don't think I've ever seen the Overton window shift so quickly, because net zero is so. Byline Times, I think they said they tried to turn this into a scandal. This Badenoch speech, where they said the Conservative Party is ditching its long-standing commitment to net zero. It isn't long-standing. Net zero, that's the term. I never even heard it until 6 years ago. Yeah, I don't think many people have. I'm sure there were some obscure journals writing about this. But until we had Greta Thunberg coming for a visit here and Extinction Rebellion, filling up the whole of Westminster for a year or so, it was just not a thing.
And I was just going to ask, Kristian, you've written a lot about the planning system, and one of the ways in which we actually can achieve net neutrality, or whatever you want to call it, is through having cheap and abundant energy, like nuclear energy. One of the reasons why we can't build small modular reactors is because of the planning system. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, yeah, that's where that's where our colleague Chris Snowden and our co-author Zion Lights come in. They've written about this phenomenon that you have pressure groups that are organized supposedly about to alleviate some social or economic or environmental problem, and then when a solution to that problem comes along but outside of their framework, they don't like it. And that triggers a not invented here mentality. And yes, environmentalist movements who are also massively anti-nuclear, that is an example of that happening. Because obviously, if you think climate change is the biggest risk facing mankind and it could lead to the literal extinction, I mean, the name Extinction Rebellion implies that's what they really believe. That's what we're up against. If that's what you think, then surely even the worst case scenario of the risks of a nuclear power station would seem trivial to you, and you should be the fiercest supporter of a permissive approach to nuclear energy. But that's not what they're doing, and it is clearly the case that so say in Britain, ideological hostility to nuclear energy is less extreme than elsewhere. So that isn't really the issue. It's not that a government has ever consciously decided to make it impossible to build nuclear reactors. It's not like the German example where phasing out nuclear energy very rapidly was clearly purely ideological. That's not what happened here. It's just that the planning system became so extreme that nuclear reactors designed in France, designed in Finland, places that are not known for lax, shoddy safety standards, couldn't be built here, that the plans had to be completely rearranged and adapted and made a lot more expensive. And that is what was gradually pricing nuclear energy out of the energy mix, and it could play a much bigger role in it.
And that's it. And just to pick you up on one thing, you said cheap and abundant, and then you said nuclear. Now, maybe nuclear energy could be cheap and abundant. The problem in Britain is that it's fundamentally very, very expensive. But that's largely because of costs that we've loaded onto it. I mean, it's an open question. You can look at something like KEPCO, the Korean nuclear developer, and think, well, they're doing it at way less cost than Britain is. Can we have some of that? It's an open question, I think. How inexpensive can we make nuclear? How competitive can it be? How much could it be market-driven and commercial rather than always having to be something that the government and the taxpayer has to stand behind? But we haven't given ourselves the opportunity to find that out, and we need to just stop making everything, well, these kind of things, so expensive, and then see what happens.
Yeah, indeed. Just moving on. So the government have made some new announcements on welfare benefits and some new reforms, which is particularly interesting. Of course, we know that the conversations around welfare reforms tend to be pretty politically loaded. We currently are in a situation in which 2.8 million people are on long-term sickness benefits. These are people that are not working and indeed are also not counted in unemployment statistics because they're deemed long-term sick. Now, I think one of the biggest tragedies about this is the vast number of young people that are my age, that are being consigned to a lifetime of worklessness, consigned to a lifetime in which they are not contributing to the economy, they're not contributing for themselves. And ultimately, I think that the real issue here is, yes, there is a lot of money that's being wasted, and ultimately it's just unsustainable. We cannot afford the welfare state at this size and the way that it's growing, but fundamentally it's a waste of human potential, and it's millions of people across the country that could be contributing and working that aren't. So the government have announced a couple of new changes. One of them is right to try, which should hopefully encourage more people to try and work and trying to find some work without the risk of losing their benefits through reassessments. They're also merging job seekers and employment support, and they're also narrowing eligibility for personal independence payments as well. Now, Professor Len Shackleton, our colleague, has argued that on PIP, personal independence payments, it should be tougher, it should be assessed in person rather than on the phone or online. Tom, what do you make of some of these reforms?
I think they're very much steps in the right direction. I think possibly you could go further in certain respects. And I think when you look at what has happened in recent years and how we got into this situation that we found ourselves in, and it's a situation which isn't really replicated in other countries. So the rise in young people seeking, out of work or in work, but sickness-related, disability-related benefits, the rise in mental health problems, etc. It's not like this is simply a post-COVID effect which has been replicated around the world. Something uniquely weird has happened in Britain, and I think it's important to try and understand why and try and correct it. And I think there are a few long-running things, and then there are maybe a few more short-term things as well. So the first one is for quite a while now, we have really clamped down fairly hard on the generosity of your standard out-of-work benefits. So they've remained pretty flat in real terms for quite a number of years. At the same time, you've gone from a position where your kind of standard out-of-work benefits and your health-related benefits were roughly the same to one where the health-related benefits are much, much more generous. And so obviously that is going to create an incentive for people to try and go for the health-related benefits instead of the standard out-of-work ones. And I'm sure that we've seen that to a certain extent. The government has tried to reduce the generosity of incapacity benefit to try and address those incentives. So that's part of what's happening. The other thing I think is that during COVID, we switched from having in-person assessments to having ones that were done remotely over the phone or over Zoom or whatever. And it's kind of interesting that remote assessments are statistically much more likely to be successful for the claimant than in-person ones. So I think it's 57% success rate for remote assessment versus 44% assessment for face-to-face assessments. And by the way, it's not just that more people are being approved remotely, but they're also, kind of on average, getting larger levels of benefit. So they're being assessed as being more in need when they're seen remotely than when they're seen face-to-face. And I'm not saying that everyone who is assessed remotely and gets a benefit is claiming it legitimately. Far from it. But very clearly, this has allowed more people to gain the system.
I think it's not just people that are necessarily gaming the system in that way. I mean, it's basically economic incentives, right? If you're being told that, I think Fraser Nelson's documentary on Channel 4 outlined this quite well, that actually a lot of the time it's not just that people are lazy and they don't want to work. A lot of these people do want to work, especially when you've been on long-term benefits for a very long time. They want to work, but it's basic incentives. If you're a young person with a young child and you're receiving £40,000 a year in totality from the government, and you're being told by government officials, if you try and retrain or attempt to apply for a job, it could risk you losing all of those benefits. Why would you risk that?
Well, I mean, incentives matter. If you know only one thing about economics, then that should be the thing that you know, and government should be bearing that in mind when they create welfare systems, tax systems, everything else. So no, that's absolutely spot on. The other thing, though, that I just thought was a really interesting idea, which I hadn't heard before, it may or may not have been completely original, but Sam Ashworth-Hayes had a piece in The Telegraph, and he floated this idea that basically claiming welfare is very state-dependent. So if you have never claimed welfare, there is a massive kind of psychological barrier to you claiming it. People who in entirely identical circumstances who've claimed before, who haven't claimed before, the people who have claimed in the past are much more likely to claim than the people who haven't. And the idea he puts across in this Telegraph piece is that, you know, through the pandemic, with furlough and various other schemes, the whole country was coming into contact with the state and getting used to the idea of claiming something back. And maybe that's shifted the psychology. And so people have gone from thinking, well, that's just not the done thing to claim if I don't really need it, to thinking I'd be an absolute mug not to claim every penny I can get, especially when my taxes have gone up and the public services I'm getting are crappy. You know, and in a very sad way, like this is the mindset of a much less developed country. Like that kind of attitude towards the state, that it's going to screw you, so you should try and get everything you can out of it, is something that's quite common in the developing world. And I think one of the things that kind of in political economy terms really holds them back, that wasn't the case in Britain. Maybe it has become the case for a variety of reasons post-COVID. And I mean, there was a piece in The Economist basically saying that the British state has a nasty case of long COVID. And you can look at that in terms of the waiting lists, and you can look at it in terms of the tax bill, the deficit, high levels of public sector employment, indeed some of this stuff to do with sickness benefits and so on, and think, yeah, you know what, we really haven't pulled things together since the coronavirus. And we need to because we're in a rough spot.
Yeah, and that's always been my objection, or one of my objections to the idea of a universal basic income, where I know some people on our side of the argument are in favor of it because they think it gets rid of some of the adverse incentives.
And the bureaucracy.
And the bureaucracy to administer it, but also that it isn't withdrawn and that therefore work incentives are better. Yes, okay, but it does promote this mentality that money comes from the government rather than it being something that you earn in the marketplace. And this may be a smaller scale version of that. So,
if not UBI, then what do you think is the solution to these problems?
Okay, well, that's a wider question about. Let's do that on a different episode. Just more specifically on the disability and incapacity benefits. I don't know what the solution is, but we should absolutely start with the recognition that, first of all, in a very short time frame, less than 5 years, the number of claimants has gone up by over 1 million. And that's absolutely unprecedented. And as you've alluded to, this is, on this trend, Britain is an outlier. This has not happened anywhere else. So even if we may have objections to the way exactly the government is trying to address it, we should start from the presumption that something has gone wrong there and something needs to be done. And it's counterproductive that large sections of the commentariat are starting from the presumption that this is just driven by mean-spiritedness. There is some agenda of hatred of disabled people, where surely and therefore the answer being we should have a wealth tax rather than messing with the benefit system. Well, even if we could find £10 billion somewhere, that doesn't mean that we should be completely blasé about how that money is spent. And if you have such a sudden increase and it's really just in one country, not replicated elsewhere, no obvious reason, then we should think about why that is.
No, that's interesting. I do think from that perspective, thinking about the fact that it's actually not good for those people to be out of work for that period of time. I also think any measure that finds that a quarter of the population are disabled is not a useful measure at all. But only time will see if any of these reforms are able to help that. Tom, Kristian, thank you very much for joining me, and thank you to all of you for watching or listening. If you're interested in learning more about the IEA's work, check out insider.iea.org.uk.